Hello and welcome to Tetch Talk, the series where we talk about technology, politics, science, and anything else that's interesting, new, and informative. Today we have Dr. Matthew Rimmer, Professor of Intellectual Property and Innovation Law at the Faculty of Business and Law, Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Queensland. We're going to be talking about the right to repair. Professor Rimmer is a staunch believer in the right to repair and has published many articles and books on the topic. So, joining me today from the opposite side of the world, Dr. Matthew Rimmer. Welcome, Dr. Rimmer. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
Good. So we're here today to talk about right to repair, which is a subject I know is quite near and dear to you, quite important to you.
Yes, look, I've been doing work on the right to repair for many years. I can't remember being a student a few decades ago, and we had debates then about the right to repair, and particularly in the context of cars and car repairs and designs. But since that time in the 1990s, the topic of the right to repair has kind of evolved and become much more broader. Particularly with the IT and consumer electronics revolution and lots of new technologies being developed in other sectors like agriculture and medicine and many other areas. So these days, the right to repair seems to have become a much broader topic for debate and discussion. And, there's still a lot of debate about cars as well, as particularly as cars become more high-tech. Some of those kind of classic questions about repairing cars have also kind of returned as well.
Oh yes, cars. A lot of the times these days have become more computers than automobiles.
So lots of kind of issues in terms of telematics and the ability of independent repairers to kind of repair cars, and some cars are very high tech these days and need lots of specialist knowledge and equipment and access to kind of perform repairs.
Especially as we're getting more towards electric cars and hybrids, stuff like that, where there's a lot of electric motors, a lot of high power electronics and computerized control systems.
Yeah, it's been very noticeable that Tesla have been a big opponent of the right to repair, and they've kind of raised many objections to the right to repair. But, some of the other car companies have also been very organized in kind of opposing the right to repair. So the automobile industry really want to kind of control aftermarkets and secondary markets in terms of repairing those vehicles. So that there remains a lot of conflict in that area.
And do you do your own car repair? Since we're talking about it.
No, curiously enough, I'm a very poor handyman, and that's why I am so interested in the right to repair. I think Billy Bragg has a song called "The Handyman Blues," and I certainly empathise with that particular song. I'm not very good at making things or fixing things or repairing things, so I am very dependent upon independent repairers and specialist repairers when my stuff gets broken.
Yeah, I do all of my own. I'll show you. Like I had I had a car go back into my own car. A few months. Let's see that. Let's see. And I don't know if you can see that.
Oh,
And so it dented in the door.
yes.
And actually, but luckily this being a GM car, a Saturn, this was plastic panels on the outside, so it was all on the crash frame inside. So just some metal damage on the inside frame. So that wasn't so bad, but had to fix this structure underneath, and it was you can see some of the denting at the top just underneath the window. But working on the inside of a car like that is daunting to many people.
Well, Australia has a long and fine tradition of customizing cars, and
Yes.
uh, Indigenous communities in Australia kind of often live in very remote and regional parts of Australia, and there's a whole tradition of bush mechanics of being
Oh,
able to
yeah.
fix things, get
But
them from one town to the next.
but but to many, with the new right, without the right to repair and stuff, it'll end up looking more like that, I think.
Yes. Well, there's also kind of a long tradition of people, modifying and super modifying their cars in Australia. We kind of have, big festivals like Summer Nats in which people
Yeah.
show off all their um, restored, remade cars. Although, Australia's last remaining car factories have shut down. So,
It's becoming a bit like the UK in that way.
yeah, that might be a bit of an issue. But even our futuristic films like Mad Max are all about
Cars, yes.
repairing and
Keeping it
fixing up
going. Yeah.
vehicles, even in a dystopian future.
Yeah, it's. I mean, we got the Nopi Nationals here around Atlanta, for example, and I used to do with a friend. We did kit cars. We had a 1971 Ford Escort turned into a World War II Willys Jeep. It looked
Well,
really cool.
as Australia is so far flung,
Oh, yeah, and spread out. Yeah,
there's always been a lot of interest in repair, just because sometimes it's difficult traversing the distance to where a repairer has been based. And, it's been interesting that, car enthusiasts and farmers have been some of the big champions of the right
yes,
to repair in Australia, just because they think that there are kind of concerns in terms of monopoly pricing in relation to spare parts and getting things fixed. And they want it to be much quicker in terms of making repairs, but much cheaper as well. So that's kind of been interesting in terms of the mobilized communities who've been pushing for the right to repair in Australia.
I perfectly said about tractors and farming and stuff. And yeah, tractors again, like cars, have become a hugely computerized these days. It's not the sort of big engine you just sit behind and toot along like the traditional 50s sort of tractors we all might think of these days. It's huge. It's complicated hydraulic system. It's all computer controlled. There's automatic tracking, computer controlled integration with the tools for things like tram lines to drive down and stuff. It's fantastically complex, and without that sort of the right to repair, it ends up as taking it to a dealer and putting it out of the reach of many.
Yeah, well, in Australia, the test case for the spare parts defence under designs law was in relation to customising cars and kind of getting special parts in from overseas. And in that kind of key dispute in the Federal Court of Australia, the spare parts exception was held to apply. But there's always, I guess, been a lot of value associated with making repairs in relation to cars. But it's kind of remained a big issue here and elsewhere. Australia doesn't necessarily have very good public transport in many parts of the country as well. So that's a bit of a factor as well.
Another factor it shares with the US thing. I think the nearest
Yeah.
bus to me is about 100 miles away. Well, it's about 70 in Atlanta. So yeah, it's
So,
yeah,
but that certainly kind of came to a head in Australia. There was a push for there to be some sort of special regime dealing with cars and independent repairs. And Treasury of the federal department kind of investigated that issue and kind of reached some sort of industry agreement. The Australian Labor Party, who are in the opposition, were really kind of pushing for more to be done. But then it's kind of been taken up into this larger inquiry by the Productivity Commission about whether there should be a general right to repair. And I was always very kind of critical of, Treasury just focusing on the car industry. I think, there are some contextual issues in terms of how different markets operate, but I think it's useful to kind of have a general principle in terms of recognizing a general right to repair rather than working out in each particular market and each particular sector some sort of agreement. So there's been a bit of debate in terms of Australia in terms of, should the right to repair be some sort of general universal principle, or is it something that's going to be much more sectoral in terms of where it operates?
It's certainly complex. But yeah, as you say, Australia's got some new laws. They've got the was it the MVIS, which I believe came into force last year, about the motor vehicle information service.
Yeah.
So,
So that was what I was kind of talking about before in terms of kind of this kind of Treasury initiated industry agreement in terms of sharing information with independent repairers, which I guess is kind of a first step, but there is kind of a broader inquiry that has kind of taken place. The Productivity Commission is a kind of an independent body in Australia, but it's often asked to engage in empirical research by the federal government into topics deserving of law reform. And they were kind of quite systematic in terms of looking at an array of different sectors in which there were concerns about repair restrictions, but they also kind of examined the different legal questions arising in relation to the right to repair, which, for Australia cut across consumer rights and competition policy, kind of raised questions around intellectual property, but it also kind of posed questions in relation to environmental law, sustainable development, and climate change. So really that inquiry, which has now produced this great open access final report that is free and available for everyone to read, that makes a number of recommendations about how we need a more holistic approach to the right to repair in Australia. But it's certainly been pushed along by developments elsewhere, in the United States. The Biden administration really picked up some of the concerns of some of the other presidential candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who were big advocates of the right to repair. Warren, particularly in relation to agriculture. Bernie Sanders, perhaps a little bit more generally. Biden, in some ways, took on some of those concerns, and in his executive orders, really emphasised that there needed to be an cross-government approach in terms of removing repair restrictions. But his appointment of Lena Khan as the head of the Federal Trade Commission was also kind of a signal that really he wanted to kind of bust up some of the monopolies that were really choking the United States, including in relation to repair markets. And Lena Khan has said that, she will use the powers of the Federal Trade Commission to investigate repair restrictions and take enforcement action where necessary. So I think that kind of had an impact upon Australia. Some of the Australian politicians, particularly with the new Albanese government, have been very interested in the work of Lena Khan, and that's been a bit of influence on them. But the European Union has been a key driver in terms of their push towards a Green New Deal and a circular economy. Their eco-design regime has been very focused upon repair. Some jurisdictions like France have kind of experimented with a repairability index and repairability labelling. So some of those developments have been kind of really important in terms of encouraging Australia to try to keep up with other jurisdictions in terms of what they're doing. But really there's a kind of a larger debate about sustainable development going on. So there's a sustainable development goal really focused on responsible consumption and production. And I think a key part of that is, developing a repair culture. And, as part of a circular economy, you really need to kind of design sustainable innovations that can be repaired So I think at a kind of a global level, there's a kind of a larger discussion taking place in relation to the right to repair as well. We're going to make a big paradigmatic shift to a culture of repair,
Mm-hmm.
and one of sustainable innovation. I think that means that we need to valorize repair and the right to repair much more than we do.
Yeah, because without it, the right to repair, it ends up being, was it like disposable devices? It's
Yeah, look, we've had these kind of throwaway cultures that have been very unsustainable in their use of products, and the way in which they exploit resources. And that has become very kind of problematic in terms of, pushing towards the sustainable development goals. We're kind of lagging behind many of the targets. We really need to kind of progress much more in terms of sustainable innovation. But there's a huge gulf between different jurisdictions. Australia has not really embraced the sustainable development goals in any kind of substantive way. Whereas in the European Union, there's been a huge amount of investment into sustainable innovation. So there does seem to be a kind of a gap or a gulf in terms of how countries are progressing in relation to this particular field.
yeah, it's
There are some new technologies that have come along, and there's been a lot of interest in terms of certain new technologies making it easier to repair things. So I'm kind of very interested in 3D printing and additive manufacturing. And, one of the kind of key applications of those technologies has been to potentially enable certain sorts of repairs on certain sorts of products. But there's a lot of discussion in terms of those sorts of questions as well, in terms of what circumstances can you deploy tools, old or new, to engage in repair or refurbishment of broken products.
yeah, it's you say 3D printing, but one of the last episodes we did of Tech Talk, we had a competitor from BattleBots to show. I'm not sure you're familiar with Robot Wars and stuff as well, but big robots fighting each other, and so they have been using cutting edge at the event 3D printing machines to try and do repairs on the thing, and helping develop things like the Mark Forged metal 3D printer, stuff like that, and trying that actually in high stress situations. And yeah, I hadn't really thought about the development of 3D printing to do it, but yes, you're absolutely right about the 3D printing and the things. Another field where I guess the right repair has been pushed, as well as cars and things, is a humble cell phone. There's been a lot of talk about cell phones and cell phone repairs, because it's a device we all have these days, and they get damaged so easily. Was it iFixit does the teardowns for new devices, isn't it, to give them a repairability score? And things like trying to repair a broken screen on one of these, or I actually have a phone where I smashed the lens assembly on it back, and I ended up having to throw the phone away because there were no parts available. The only way you could get it was to basically buy a whole new, complete new camera assembly, which was the same price as the new phone, which was just
There's certainly
crazy.
been a lot of debate about repair of phones and tablets. Particularly there's been a lot of controversy over Apple and its approach to repairs.
With the touch sensor thing, especially, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's been controversy that, Apple seemingly have kind of pursued a kind of a model of rapid obsolescence, in which they would prefer consumers to buy new things rather than allow things to be fixed. And that has not necessarily been keeping with its original ethos or its kind of pretensions to be a sustainable, climate-aware company. Indeed, Steve Wozniak was very critical of the company for taking action against independent repairers in jurisdictions like Norway. Apple seems to have relented a little bit and have said, oh, we will allow for a wider range of repairs, but there seems to be still some skepticism about Apple's commitment to the right to repair and its willingness to allow independent repairers to kind of repair products, particularly, phones and tablets. I just got my old iPod repaired. Its kind of battery had died, and Apple no longer properly make iPods anymore. And it took me a few months with my local independent repairer to get parts and to get a new battery and to fix the screen I think that's kind of quite problematic, particularly because we're so dependent and reliant on our phones for lots of different things these days.
Oh, yes.
It's really an option not to have a working phone anymore. There's certainly been a lot of discussion in that area, and there is quite a notable community of repair shops and maker spaces and fab labs that do work on repairing phones and tablets. But sometimes it's not just the parts, it's also various other features that allow a product to be used. So, there have been complaints that Apple has sometimes bricked products in which they have taken the view that there hasn't been an authorized repair of some kind. So I think that's kind of problematic. Yeah. So I think that has been kind of quite problematic in the area of repair, in terms of consumer rights and in terms of competition. I think there are lots of issues there, but there's also questions around intellectual property, because Apple have often relied on intellectual property to take action against independent repairers. Well, sometimes successfully, even though I wasn't necessarily very convinced by their trademark action against an independent repairer in Norway. The Norwegian courts found her in favour of Apple. So that has been quite problematic as well.
Yeah, and they've also, I was about to say, they've also used at times different bits as well to try and make it impossible to gain access. So, for instance, I had to recently replace the fan on a laptop, but because it was a regular Windows laptop, the screwdriver set did the job. But with an Apple, you have to have a special bit, isn't it? There's like a tri-lobed one with a security hole down the middle and some weird thing like that. You can only get certain places and special sizes, or actually 3D print them now. But it just preventing you from not even being able to open it to access it. It's a enforced no user serviceable parts sticker.
Well, as you mentioned before, iFixit have been kind of very concerned about this issue, and they have tried to provide some ratings for products in terms of the ease with which they can be repaired. And, iFixit have been very kind of concerned about, Apple in particular, really designing their products in such a way as to impede and obstruct repair. Really iFixit are trying to push manufacturers to think about, designing products in the future that are much more easily open to repair. But I think that has become a really big issue. But also sometimes questions around, access to repair manuals as well has been the subject of debate. So iFixit have often kind of faced issues in terms of their efforts to publish manuals online. They have often received in turn copyright takedown notices. And there's been a debate about whether the publication of those manuals is fair use or not. There was a big hearing in the past week in the United States Congress on the topic of, is there a right to repair? amongst other things, there was a bit of debate about repair manuals. And Professor Aaron Personowski was arguing that really there should only be thin protection for repair manuals because, much of the information in repair manuals is factual and ideas and, processes and not kind of subject matter that is normally kind of protected by copyright law. But it's hard to fix something if you don't have access to a manual.
Yeah. And so we go back to the cars earlier. I grew up with the fixing my own cars, and we had the Haynes manuals and the Chilton manuals, and I keep one in every car just in case. But they did it by reverse engineering, by taking a car and stripping it down and photographing it as it went along. And a lot of the times now with software and stuff, you can't do that now easily because it's a black box system, which is where this comes in difficult.
Well, different regimes of intellectual property kind of deal with reverse engineering in slightly different ways as well. Copyright law is expanded and, it also kind of provides special protection for technological protection measures, digital locks. And that has kind of provided additional problems in terms of accessing products. But say something like an Apple iPhone, there's copyright protection, there's patent protection, there's design protection, there's trademark protection, and you often enter a contract when you kind of purchase a product as well.
Trade
so there
secrets.
are layers and layers of intellectual property protection. And there's not necessarily a clear articulation of the right to repair as a defence across those regimes. In different countries, in the United States and now more recently in Australia, there has been, recognition of exhaustion of rights. That, once you sell a product, you can exhaust your intellectual property rights in relation to the product once you kind of sell it. But those doctrines don't necessarily kind of provide very bright lines for, what conduct is acceptable and what is not. So in Australia, we had this case that went to the High Court, which involved printer cartridges and refurbishing printer cartridges.
Yeah.
And there was a long discussion about, was that refurbishment or was that repair? Was it a case of exhaustion of rights? There was recognition of exhaustion in the end. I'm not sure the decision provides very clear guidance for other participants in that market.
Really. No, and it doesn't help overall with the bigger problem, which is the fact that printer ink is so expensive still.
Yeah, well, they're kind of artificial monopolies. So I've been talking there about intellectual property, and I guess I've long been arguing we need a consistent recognition of the right to repair across all the disciplines of intellectual property. But of course, there is also a crossover into consumer law and competition policy. Americans would call competition policy antitrust. But, restrictions in relation to repair certainly raise larger questions about whether there is anti-competitive behaviour and conduct by monopolies. And I guess there's been a great deal of concern by the Federal Trade Commission that monopolies are being formed in a range of different aftermarkets and secondary markets, and that has having very adverse impacts upon consumers in a range of different marketplaces in the United States. And there's certainly some parallel concerns in Australia, particularly in certain sectors. So, in agriculture, there has been, a great deal of concern that there has been anti-competitive behaviour, particularly around repairs for tractors and agricultural machinery. In the United States, there has been some litigation against John Deere over agricultural machinery. So the United States, in some ways, has a little bit more enterprising lawyers and law firms, and some of them have been willing to kind of bring actions under consumer law or raise questions around our antitrust law. But obviously we need there to be a philosophical change in approach to questions of competition, but there needs to be much more enforcement action. It's been very problematic in the United States and Australia in particular that, big monopolies have been able to do what they like for so many decades with a very laissez-faire approach by regulators, and that has been hugely kind of costly for a range of different players. Consumers, small businesses, and others have been particularly hard hit by some of the impacts of that.
On the plus side, it means lots and lots of profit for the manufacturers, which is, the thing. I mean, that's why a lot of politicians are clearly hesitant to get involved, is because it's money to contributors and yeah.
Well, there's been huge popular support for the right to repair across many different jurisdictions, but there has been a very concerted campaign to kind of thwart right to repair initiatives. So in the United States, there has been lots of state-based efforts to try to recognise the right to repair in different sectors. So, Massachusetts in relation to cars,
New York,
Colorado, right to repair in relation to wheelchairs. But many other initiatives kind of face these kind of concerted, attacks by industry associations and groups and, companies who want to kind of preserve their monopolies. And there's also been kind of threats of legal action as well. So that was certainly something that kind of came out of the discussions in the US Congress the other day. That there needs to be a better approach than state-by-state based initiatives. And, there were several different federal bills looking at the right to repair in the United States that are being mooted. But, the US is a little bit peculiar in terms of that mixture of state and federal.
You could have stopped it a bit peculiar, yeah.
Well, Australia, we have a federal system as well, but, I think it's been recognised that really the federal government needs to kind of take leadership in terms of the topic of the right to repair. But in the United States, just because it's so hard to get anything through the Congress, often there have been these other local initiatives. But it has been disturbing how many of the local proposals have been crushed by this industry opposition.
Who can repair those computers and how is already being considered at the state level. Citizens in Massachusetts, for example, passed the ballot initiative requiring any car with a telematics system to incorporate an open access data system allowing any repair shop to access the data. In response, some car companies simply cut off access to remote start and other software-powered accessories, depriving consumers of these features.
Even though they have been politically popular, the mixture of money and politics in the United States has been such.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
That, there has been really concerted efforts to derail those initiatives. So it was with a mixture of optimism and pessimism that I listened to the few hours of the hearing the other day, chaired by the Republican Darrell Issa. There did seem to be some politicians across the Democrats and the Republicans who had a mutual interest in the topic.
The right to repair is about empowering consumers, promoting competition, and extending innovation. It can be key. It can be a key driver of growth and prosperity. Right to repair fosters consumer choice and freedom to enable consumers to protect their investment and extend the lifespan of their product and devices. It is a fundamental consumer principle.
We should all agree that there is a problem with repair today, and when the only option is to just buy a new one, we all lose.
But obviously there are also industry-backed interests there who were denying the very existence of a right to repair.
You answer the question because I just want to know if I want that Apple product badly enough to submit, if you will, to having to pay for it 3 times, then why should we let this right, so-called right to repair interfere with that agreement?
And said that the very concept was a myth, a fiction, an invention.
Right to repair supporters want lawmakers to force manufacturers to make the tools, parts, and know-how needed to facilitate repairs available to consumers and independent repair shops. And the assumption here is that anything standing in the way of repair opportunities must necessarily harm the public good. But these tools, parts, and know-how are often protected by IP rights, such as copyrights and design patents. And we protect copyrighted works and patented inventions because, as the Constitution recognizes, this promotes the public good. We reward creators and innovators as an incentive for them to bring these things to the marketplace. And the public benefits from the introduction of new products and services that increase competition. Thus, the right to repair movement isn't based on a pre-existing right. It's instead asking lawmakers to create a new right at the expense of the existing rights of IP owners.
So, it's very hard to shift the status quo, I think, in this area. And it's also kind of so complex and abstract with it cutting across so many different sectors as well. So it was curious that, the congressional inquiry said, we can't deal with competition issues or antitrust issues, as Americans call them, because there's a completely different committee that has jurisdiction over antitrust issues.
This hearing marks a unique opportunity for members of the subcommittee to come together to learn the positions of all sides of the right to repair ecosystem that this subcommittee has jurisdiction over. It is clear that this subcommittee lacks jurisdiction in antitrust, which will be taken up by another committee.
So I think that has kind of been a real issue in relation to the right to repair. It can become a very fractured discussion because there are so many legal disciplines implemented or implicated by the area and are involved in terms of the implementation of a right to repair. So it's kind of technically difficult, I think, to try to get some sort of new framework in place to promote the right to repair.
So one of the things that was brought up again in the meeting last week, the congressional hearing, and by others who oppose the right to repair, is safety. So Darrell Issa said about airbags when repairing cars.
The right to repair does have to be balanced with a deep and legitimate concern for safety. I think there can be no better example than that of the factory-equipped airbags. We also know that manufacturers live in terror that an automobile that has had its airbags deployed will have a replacement or a bypass put onto that vehicle and ultimately lead to the death or injury of a passenger.
But there's also things like refrigerant levels and dumping of those into atmospheres and things like that. What are your thoughts regards to the worries and concerns about safety? I mean, apart from the whole fact that for a Republican to be worried about safety when their attitude on guns is, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's often been a debate about how will the right to repair affect the safety of products. Can take on some different contexts depending upon the sort of technology that you are discussing. So there's quite a bit of discussion at the hearing over cybersecurity and information security. I guess the opponents of the right to repair argue that it will make products much more insecure. The advocates of the right to repair argue that it will make products more secure and more safe because they, more people will kind of more weaknesses and identify issues and And I guess that has been a kind of a rolling part of the debate over the right to repair. In certain contexts, there has been discussion about whether there should be special treatment of some technologies. So there has been a bit of a sub-debate about whether there should be a medical right to repair. So another US Congressman, Ron Wyden from Oregon, a Democrat, was an advocate of a medical right to repair bill during the COVID crisis, because he was kind of concerned that there were ventilators and other technologies that couldn't be fixed properly during the COVID crisis. And there needed to be some safety valve to ensure that those technologies could still be used and fixed. That bill, like many bills, was entered the US Congress but didn't kind of progress any further.
Yeah.
At the debate last week in the US Congress, there was some discussion about whether medical safety had special considerations and, whether or not there should be different rules dealing with medical right to repair in terms of the qualifications required of repairers or
home repairers, yeah.
But, it has also been an area in which there has been some really bad monopolies have formed in relation to hospital products and medical products.
Yes. I've experienced that myself recently. My wife had pneumonia last year, and it was just difficult to even get things like oxygen machines that she needed.
So that has been a kind of really interesting area of debate and probably deserves a bit more attention. But the medical device manufacturers have been really fighting hard to exclude themselves from the discussion about the right to repair and argue that they should be treated differently. But, it should be noted that there's also other regulatory rules in place for certain sorts of technologies. So, certain sectors sometimes have their own health and safety rules or have their own heightened regulation of certain products. So the Food and Drug Administration sometimes have their own regulatory rules in place in relation to healthcare devices. But that's certainly the case in terms of certain sectors as well. So there are certain specialized rules, for instance, in relation to aircraft, for aircraft safety and aircraft repairs. So it's still possible in terms of the way in which regulation works that certain sectors will be subjected to heightened safety rules. In the Australian context, the view was really there had not been sufficient evidence presented by technology developers that the right to repair somehow imperiled safety or led to insecurity. So, the Productivity Commission is very focused on evidence. I didn't think that there was sufficient evidence to substantiate some of the broad claims that were being made.
You don't have cars that are just exploding from your car culture. They're not just running down the street and just bing.
Well, I think the other part of the discussion is to have is really around questions around insurance.
Yeah.
For there to be a right to repair put in place, it often kind of raises questions around insurance as well. And, independent repairers in Australia have to come get their own insurance. But there is also, I guess, maker spaces and hacker spaces and fab labs have also had to kind of grapple with questions of insurance. In Brisbane, where I live, there's a subsidy called Logan, and it has a repair cafe, which kind of does lots of really interesting repair-based work. But, you know, it has to kind of think about its insurance as well in terms of the work that it's doing. So I guess that's another aspect of that conversation to have in terms of management of risk. It does kind of raise questions around liability and risk. And it's kind of always kind of interesting to see how the legal system kind of deals with some of those questions and some of those issues. I guess there's been a lot of concern in Australia around rising interest or rising insurance rates as everything else goes up. There's certainly been higher insurance cover that has sometimes been required for repair-related activity. So I guess that's another element to that discussion. But, you know, I guess from a legal perspective, that there's always kind of questions around, you know, legal action can be brought in relation to defective products, and sometimes that's the original product.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be a badly repaired product as well. There has been some discussion as well around the use of warranties. You know, in Australia, our consumer law is such that, you know, there are requirements in relation to scope for repairs. And the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has been saying that, you know, some contracts try to exclude repairs and they are not valid.
Yeah. I remember my very first computer, actually, a Dragon 32, all the way back in the mid-80s, which had over the holes for each of the things, had a little sticker saying, you know, warranty void if breached and stuff. Yeah,
well, that was a big issue with the Productivity Commission inquiry in Australia. So that sort of behaviour seemed to be widespread, in which technology developers were making false claims that warranty was voided if repairs took place by someone other than an official repairer. And the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has kind of made warnings that it will kind of take action over those false claims on the basis that they are misleading and deceptive and not aligned with what the Australian consumer law says. But that, I guess that's been a problem in relation to the area. There's been a lot of misinformation in relation to repair as well.
And that's why I'm so happy to have had you here with me, helping to explain this to everybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, that there's a lot to be said in terms of boosting literacy around the right to repair, but, you know, there are certainly parts of consumer law that can enhance consumer rights around repair, and you know, I think that there has been sometimes technology developers have tried to make assertions that are not in keeping with what is actually within consumer law. But also in Australia, there was a discussion about the need to rebalance the bargaining power. You know, you have these very uneven contests between big technology developers like Apple and John Deere and others, and very small little consumers. So in Australia, there was a bit of discussion about, you know, do we need to allow consumer advocacy groups to bring action? Do we need proper class actions? You know, we did have a very successful class action against VW over Dieselgate. But we don't really have the same level of class actions that happen in say, the US system. But I think that has been a big issue in terms of the sector as well, in terms of, you know, that it's not necessarily a very even playing field in terms of some of those discussions that have been taking place. You know, technology developers have often just thumbed their nose at consumers, even though consumers may have rights that have been adversely affected. So there seems to be a bit of a gap there. You know, if the regulator themselves do not take action, how can we help individual consumers take action? are there other entities or groups that could play a role in this field? And I think that has been a big problem in terms of the sector. Does the consumer have much recourse when their stuff breaks down, or they go to Apple and Apple tells you that it's much easier to, buy something new or pay an extremely high repair fee for an official repair?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen videos as a Canadian consumer affairs program. They had a thing where they took an iPad which just needed a simple cable reconnected, and they're taking it in. Oh no, it just needs it's wet, it's damaged, it's done. You need to pay brand new computer rather than just $10 for 20 minutes of labor.
There has been a bit of a push for the right to repair in Canada as well. There has been a private bill that's been put into the Parliament, which would really deal with some of the concerns about copyright law and digital locks impeding repairs. I think the Trudeau government have said that they're going to kind of have a platform on the issue in the next election.
Well,
but yeah, again, we're very dependent in Canada for individual politicians to kind of raise the issue. There's also been some state or provincial politicians in Canada who have pushed for a right to repair in Ontario and elsewhere. But Canada, much like Australia and the United States, has a lot of very far-flung places in which it is a long way away from independent repairers or repairers. So
like up in Manitoba and Yucatan and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's
so that there's been a lot of interest in terms of dealing with that issue, and cross-party support for a repair amongst individual politicians. From the Bloc Québécois to the Greens to the Conservatives to the Liberals in Canada, politicians from all the main parties who are advocates of the right to repair. I was part of a special collection from the Berkeley Technology Law Journal.
That's right. I remember you sent it to me, yes.
And it was a kind of a symposium as well. And, that's free and openly accessible. But we had participants from a range of different jurisdictions in the symposium. But there are some papers there looking at the US and Australia and Canada and the EU and their particular approaches to the right to repair. So there's certainly some particular flavours to the different campaigns and the different jurisdictions. And, perhaps, in the United States, there's been a very strong focus upon the right to repair as a competition issue and as an IP issue. In the European Union, there's a much stronger emphasis upon environmental issues and sustainability issues. But, Australia and Canada, perhaps there's much more of a crossover issue, and there are an array of different matters being raised. But, in Canada, first up, it seems to be being dealt with as an intellectual property issue in terms of the bill in Canada. So, so it's kind of interesting to see how different jurisdictions kind of address a kind of a common issue, particularly because many of the companies that we're talking about are big multinational global companies who sell their products in many different jurisdictions. It would be helpful if we could kind of push towards a treaty or convention or agreement on a right to repair at an international level, so we could have a bit more harmonisation. I am a little bit concerned that it could be very easy that we end up with a very diverse set of different solutions, as it were, in different jurisdictions to deal with the question of the right to repair. But, it is a kind of a global issue. There is a sustainable development goal focused on responsible consumption and production. It would be useful and helpful to have a international framework to deal with the right to repair. So we had some sort of common definitions and principles and areas in which there needs to be law reform. So I think a problem in terms of the right to repair is that, thus far there's been some very ad hoc and reactive efforts to try to set up
And it's all small as well.
regimes in certain industries and certain sectors. And we do need to push towards a universal right to repair so that there is freedom to tinker. So I think that's a really important goal to strive towards as well in terms of some international legal action in that space.
So you mentioned earlier about the repair thing and insurance as well. What would you think of, say, a system then implemented, sort of giving a sort of a plate system? So like a training be an L plate, or somebody who's just a new thing being a P plate sort of thing, and their insurance rates accordingly, kind of like a certification sort of thing, and that would address some of the problems and the concerns. But
it's certainly an issue for makerspaces. I know makerspaces are very interested in occupational health and safety issues, and they often set up the spaces in such a way as to require students or users of the makerspace to do certain training before they're allowed to graduate from different kinds of equipment.
Yeah.
In some universities, that's very systematic in terms of, you're required to do so many hours until you're allowed to move on to using bigger and better equipment. But, I think there's also another aspect of it that we haven't really properly discussed, is that it's also repair is a great way to learn new skills.
Oh, yeah.
And engage in new forms of training education. So in Brisbane, where I live, we have a tools library, and that, loans out tools of one kind or another for common usage. The makerspace just across the river from where I work at the State Library of Queensland, it's called The Edge, but it is really interested in using its makerspace to help disadvantaged communities or communities with low digital literacy. So, it kind of uses its makerspace for refugee communities, seniors, kids, Indigenous communities, and, building and fixing things and repairing things is part of, building up greater skills and knowledge and literacy. In Australia, we kind of have a men's shed movement. I don't know if there's quite an equivalent in the United States, but
not quite. I know that there is in Britain. So yes.
Well, it gets a lot of funding, and that is very much focused upon developing new skills, developing new kinds of knowledge. There, social enterprises in particular have been very interested in the empowering activities of engaging in making and repairing work. The social enterprise that I can think of in Logan, it has a very keen interest in, training up people who are unemployed or underemployed, communities with people with disability. They kind of really think that there's a social value out of participating in repairing things.
Oh, definitely.
So I think that's one of the really interesting and dynamic aspects of that movement. In the European Union with Fab Labs, there's a very kind of communal social aspect to those operations. So, they have repair manifestos in the Fab Labs.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're looking at somebody who spent most of his late teens on a Saturday and Sunday in a garage with my friends, working on cars, working on robots, working on fake firearms for movie props, for all kinds of stuff. Yeah, definitely.
So there's certainly a very social aspect in terms of those Fab Labs help to serve the community, and including repairing broken things within that community. But often those Fab Labs work together on different projects as well. So I think that's a really important dimension as well in terms of the repair cafe movement. Has some really interesting kind of social dimensions to the work that takes place within those communities, which is really interesting.
So far, you give me a huge list on one side here of basically all the great things about the right to repair. And on the other side, all we basically established is it's going to cost companies money because they won't be able to profit as heavily from it. So it seems like it's pretty much a no-brainer. But that's I mean, we've been going to this for a lot longer than I expected, certainly. I think, and for which I thank you for your time.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of a question of how do you translate the popular support around the right to repair into political change. And we've often depended upon there being particularly inspirational, perceptive leaders to push the cause forward. So here in Australia, the ACT Attorney General Shane Raftenbury has been a key driver of agitating the cause for law reform. You know, in the United States Congress, there seems to be half a dozen congressmen and women who are particularly interested in the right to repair, who have put forward bills and proposals and initiatives. You know, in Canada, there are very kind of particular individual politicians who have been pushing forward with bills. You know, the European Union, the right to repair seems to be at a much more policymaker level in which the European Commission is pushing for the right to repair. You know, we've also kind of relied on community groups like iFixit, who Kyle Wines was at the US Congressional inquiry, and you know he's been a great advocate for the right to repair. We've also had some great scholars like Aaron Pezanowski and Pamela Sampson who have been big champions of the right to repair. But, you know, much like many other civil rights campaigns, you know, the right to repair, I think, will take a lot of community building and political energy to try to achieve some lasting law reform, because there are some very vested interests in that sector who are very steadfastly opposed to the right to repair and will do their best to try to oppose, derail, sabotage any of the initiatives that are put forward in relation to the right to repair. So it's not necessarily an area in which automatically there will be a victory for the cause for the right to repair. It might take some very concerted efforts over a number of years to really kind of make some meaningful changes to gain some better recognition of the right to repair. And I'm sure that will involve building many coalitions between affected interest groups and affected communities. So in the Australian debate, we've had to work very hard to build up a broader case for the right to repair, because often we've had there's been the car enthusiasts and the farmers and those concerned about watches and those concerned about tablets. You have to try to draw together those various affected parties into a broader coalition for a right to repair. And then, of course, even if you get up a bill, there's bound to be litigation as well.
Oh, yes.
And big companies will try to challenge and invalidate new legislative initiatives around the right to repair or roll them back through political pressure. So that's worthwhile thinking about as well in terms of what test cases will there be in the future.
Indeed. So getting towards the end now, but one final question. What exactly would be your dream right to repair law? What would it entail? What would it provide? What would it constitute?
Well, as discussed before, I think it needs to be a general, universal right to repair rather than some sort of industry-specific or technology-specific right to repair. We need to have a kind of a general right to repair as a starting principle. In terms of intellectual property, I think we need defences across all the different sectors of intellectual property dealing with repair. At the moment, it's a little bit haphazard. It's very dependent upon which field of intellectual property you're talking about as to what defences and exceptions should be made available. We need stronger consumer rights to really embed the right to repair in terms of consumer rights. We need some enforcement action by competition regulators. Clearly there's been some very big monopolies that have been created in certain fields of technologies, and that has been very kind of problematic. We need some actual action under competition law, and maybe we need some further reforms in relation to competition law as well. But also we need to kind of take some further action in terms of product stewardship, in terms of designing products that are sustainable, that are open to be repaired, that are a part of a circular economy. We have much more work to do to transition economies to circular economies. That is really important in terms of larger action towards sustainable development and climate action as well. So, Shane Rattenbury, the big right to repair champion in Australia, has said that, he sees the right to repair as being part of the action towards climate action, because you're really designing products so they have less emissions. So, they use less resources. It's kind of part of that larger effort. So we do need a very holistic campaign for a right to repair, which encompasses all those different dimensions of the right to repair. So I think that's what I'm really kind of pushing towards. And it was certainly reinforced for me watching the US Congressional debate. Some of that debate kind of lapsed into very industry-specific discussions about what should a right to repair look like in Massachusetts for cars. I think we do need to kind of press towards a much more general, universal vision of the right to repair, rather than allowing the right to repair to be compartmentalized into different disciplines and different industries and different technologies. We really need to work on the notion of the right to repair as a universal right. So I think that's my grand vision for a right to repair. But I've published a few things on the right to repair of late, and you should put a link to the Berkeley Technology Law Journal special issue. So
I have, in fact, when you said it, there was a QR link across the bottom of the screen while you were talking about it earlier, just to make sure.
But the Productivity Commission inquiry in Australia is, has finished its inquiry. It's been published, so its report is also open and available. There's some good work being done in this space, and we can kind of all improve our knowledge and literacy around the right to repair.
Perfect. I mean, I look forward to it. You sign me up. I'm there. Well, you already know I'm there. I'm part of it. But
okay, thank you very much for the chat.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Matthew Rimmer, Professor of Intellectual Property at the Faculty of Business and Law, Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. And again, thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing with this. And you take care.
All the best.
Right.
All the best.
So again, I want to thank Dr. Rimmer for his participation, and I want to thank you all for watching Tetch Talk. If you want to get involved and learn more about the right to repair movement and its fights, there are some links coming up on your screen right now. We'll be back soon with another episode of Tetch Talk. Until then, I've been Tetch. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, be safe, and I'll see you next time.